for this flight, let's actually do the second wine first, just to give a break from Rioja and explain a little, try and synthesize Rioja a little bit by moving to Ribera and talking about Ribera. So let's do the Pingus first, which is the Flor de Pingus. So Flor de Pingus, so we're going to go down to another valley, and that's the Ribeira del Duero. And it will actually, of course, the map is entirely accurate. The river will eventually drain out into Portugal where it becomes the Douro. So the Ribeira del Duero. Now, okay, here. The Ribeira del Duero, and it was funny going there, everyone said this, the Ribeira del Duero is very long. It's 75 kilometers long, so I think it comes close to Rioja or ties Rioja in its length. It's also entirely inland with no outlet to the Mediterranean, so it's warmer and quite a lot warmer. It actually has very significant differences in two soil types. There are two major soil types, one to the south of the river, one to the north of the river, and there's also a lot of flat land here that stretches down into the river. Now, amazingly enough, none of that is categorized. So one of the things about Ribera is all these different things that are going on in Ribera really don't ever show up on labels. Now there might be a good reason for that, and it was explained to me by a famous vintner named Telmo Rodriguez, and we're going to end up selling some of his wines, and we already do sell some of his wines. And I kind of think it was a little bit of bullshit, but
he sells really well.
Yeah, he sells really well. So, but I'll give you my version, and then I'll tack on what he said. Ribera del Duero has two really significant things in terms of wine sales going on in it. The first very significant thing is right on this edge of Ribera del Duero is a winery named Vega Sicilia. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and we actually have a bottle of Vega Sicilia. I'll go grab it in a little bit.
You want to open it?
Yeah, if you want to grab it. And,
you want to open it?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's 600 a bottle, so let's taste it. We really get to know Vega Sicilia. So Vega Sicilia sits on this far end of Ribera del Duero. Vega Sicilia is, I think, now 175 or 180 years old, and it predates the DO of Ribera del Duero by, I think, like 150 years. So it is by far more long-lasting than the DO of Ribera del Duero itself. Also interesting is Vega Sicilia is planted with Tempranillo, of course, but then Cab and Merlot. And that's how it's always been planted. So if you think Cab and Merlot are French varieties, well, the longest standing winery, the winery that is the DO, or at least stretches far beyond the DO, is a blend of Tempranillo, Cab, and Merlot. So very unusual for that. Vega Sicilia is also very unusual because up until, I think, the 1970s, it was only given away as a state gift or to royalty. So Charles and Diana's wedding, the wedding wine was Vega Sicilia Unico. Yeah, so commercially, it's incredibly important because it has this dynastic reputation, and it's only given to kings and queens, right? So very, very important in the DO, and everyone references Vega Sicilia in the DO. So if you're making wine in Ribera del Duero, you can't avoid talking about Vega Sicilia. Now, that relates to what Telmo Rodriguez said, which is, well, if you think if Vega Sicilia is your reference point, or the elephant that you always have to acknowledge, well, it's always a blend of grapes, and then it's always a blend of vineyards across the region. So it's across the entire region. Yes, the winery is sitting there, and yes, most of their vineyards are there, but they have vineyards all across the region. So if you're talking about classic historical winemaking in Ribera, and you want to make a historical wine in Ribera, well, you're making a blend. And you're making a blend from different grapes, and you're making a blend from different vineyards. That is the tradition of Ribera as set by Vega Sicilia. So, may or may not be bullshit, but he also makes a blend across all his vineyards. So there are lots of different soil types, but most of them are not acknowledged. You can see it in the vineyards, and it's pretty profound when you're going in the vineyards. Maybe at some point that'll change, but for now, no. Now, the other major thing in Ribera that is really important to understand comes to us in this glass of Pingus. So let's taste this guy. That's delicious.
It really is.
Yeah, I'm not going to spit that anymore. Okay, so the other thing that happens in Ribera is actually really due to the American wine writer Robert Parker. And Robert Parker comes to Ribera del Duero, and he comes to Ribera in the early 1990s, and he starts liking the wine a lot. This was also a time when, yeah, there are a lot of vineyards in Ribera del Duero, and most of them are cheap, and most of the fruit is fairly cheap. So these two combinations collide, and they collide with this wine, Pingus. So Pingus is actually made by a man named Peter Sissek. He's a Dane, so he's a Dane in Spain. Yes.
Mainly on the plain.
Mainly on the plains, yes, on the flatlands. Peter Sissek got the wine bug. He stops in Bordeaux, and he stops on the right bank in Pomerol. He gets a stint at Petrus and other famous wineries. Of course, buying land in Pomerol is out of the question. Buying fruit in Pomerol is out of the question. So he comes down to Ribera in the early 1990s, works at a couple of different wineries, and decides, you know, hey, look, fruit is really cheap here. And also telling people how he wants the fruit grown, he can make that happen. And it takes a very small investment for him to buy some fruit and buy some barrels and make wine. So he goes and he does that, and he makes a wine called Pingus. And Pingus's first vintage, I think, is released, and it's something like 356 packs in total for the world. So it's a very small production wine. But Robert Parker comes along and tastes it and awards it 100 points. Now, 100 points means something in this day and age, but I can remember way back when 100 points meant something very different, and 100 points from Robert Parker meant something very different way back when. You know, there are a lot of different people reviewing now. Robert Parker doesn't review anymore. Lisa Perotti Brown took his place. So there are a lot of people giving a lot of wines 100 points, whereas back then, Robert Parker giving you 100 points meant you were a seminal, singular wine in the world. So Peter Sissek's Pingus immediately sells out. And in fact, to this day, Pingus immediately sells out. And to this day, Pingus costs $1,200 a bottle. Yeah, so it's an amazing commercial success.
Yeah, commercial.
So it's commercial success. And I've had the wine. I've had the 96 and 01, and it's amazing wine if you like the style. It actually was really good. But the thought process you can imagine that goes on here is, holy shit, all these poor farmers in Ribera del Duero, Peter Sissek just bought our grapes and turned it into, when I started with Pingus, it was $300 a bottle, turned it into a $300 bottle of wine. You know, that's a really mind trip if you're, you know, selling your fruit for $300 a ton and someone's going to make, you know, 4,000% on it. So that actually becomes another significant benchmark for Ribera del Duero. The possibility to make this gigantic leap, both, I suppose, in terms of quality, but also in terms of money that could be made with grapes. So Ribera del Duero has a lot of new wineries in it, and that's really since 1995. The other thing that happens is Peter Sissek was making wine in a very particular way. And he's toned it down a bit, and sorry, I want to keep you guys drinking. He's toned it down a bit, but this definitely reflects it, right? This reflects his style of wine.
That's very good. I really like this.
Now keep in mind, he came from Pomerol, where they're making Merlot. Merlot is a very plush grape variety. They're also using a lot of oak and Pomerol. No one complains about oak and Pomerol, but a lot of Pomerol is 100% new oak. So Peter Sissek comes down, and what he's got as a raw material is Tempranillo. So what he starts doing is asking he's buying fruit, so asking the people he's buying fruit from to let the grapes ripen a lot longer. Increase the sugar content, increase the dark fruit character, the big berry currant character to it, get rid of any green smells from the fruit, get it very dark. And then what he's going to do is he's going to oak it in 100% new French oak. At one point, he was actually oaking it in 200% new French oak. And the way you do that is you ferment in new French oak and you rack it all out of what you fermented it in and put it back in new French oak. So 2 barrels, one for fermenting at 100%, one for aging, and 100% new French oak. So he's making it 100% new French oak. Now this would become called Parkerization, a very Parker style of wine. It's the style that Parker liked. So this is very significant for Ribera del Duero because you get a lot of producers who are looking at this and saying, wait a second, again, the money factor is huge, the differential, but we can ripen our grapes longer and we can buy French barrels, and if we make our wines clean and we've got subsidies to buy new equipment to make it clean, we can make a wine like Peter Sissek makes. And so you get a lot of Ribera del Duero that follows in his footsteps, making wine that way. So very significant, and it's funny because almost every producer there references Vega Sicilia and then also Pingus. So, and what now in this area, this little cluster right at the top, has become known as the $1 Million Mile, because it's a series of wineries who are worth over $1 million, and Pingus is there, and Vega Sicilia is there, and a little cluster of wineries. Now, I think the update to that is that kind of tradition, or if you would call it a tradition, that kind of style of winemaking has in general eased back a little bit. Peter Sissek has eased back a little bit from that style, but I think every vintner has eased back a little bit from that style. I think some of that would be because of backlash of making very alcoholic, very oak-driven wines. Some of it, I think, is also finding the style. If you start out in 95, 96, making something brand spanking new, well, by the time you hit 2020, you've only had so many tries at it, 15 tries at it, to see where and what the style is. So by and large, you still get very big wines out of Ribera. It is a hotter area. It lends itself to darker fruit characters. To me, it'll always be more black fruit than Rioja will be. And the Pingus still has a big, bold character to it, but is not as highly concentrated as it once was. So that's the introduction to Pingus and also Ribera del Duero. Now, that probably steals Rhoda's thunder, but I think it gives a good impression of what I'm breaking it a little bit. So, with the advent of Peter Sissek in Ribera, that also affected the rest of Spain as well. And of course, Rioja is very close, so it started also affecting Rioja. And again, the thought process was pretty much the same. Wait a second, this foreigner in Ribera del Duero is buying fruit and he's selling it for 4,000 times on the bottle. We can do that as well. We can buy modern equipment as well. We can buy new oak barrels as well. So Rioja had the same experience to it. And actually, this is why I wanted to divorce it from what you had before. Rioja's experience happened also in the mid-90s and accelerated and generally then stopped, by this day and age. But there was still Rioja producers going for very high extraction and lots of new oak to the wine. Now, interestingly enough, Rota in its first two vintages was one of those wineries. It was a winery that was a micro winery. It was founded as a garagista winery. It was founded on Tempranillo with lots of extraction and 100% new oak. It got very highly rewarded for two vintages, and then things kind of fell apart a little bit. And then it was bought by the man who distributes Coca-Cola across all of Spain. And he decided he wanted to not continue in that style and change the style. So the point of Rota is that he didn't want to be classical like Lopez de Heredia, but he also didn't want to, if you'll beg the term, be hyper modern like what Pingus was in 1996. He wanted something in between. He wanted the wines to taste modern. He wanted the wines to show fruit. He felt like that fruit could use an appropriate amount of oak to it, but didn't need to be extreme. So I hear that a lot from producers in Rioja, specifically Ribera, just a little bit different of a story, but I hear that a lot from producers in Rioja in this day and age, and I think Rota is a nice exemplar of that. It's a modern wine, it's not classical, but it's also not all the way. And I think also a different conception than what Bilar is doing, whereas Bilar is single vineyards and expression of fruit.
Very contemporary.
Yeah, Rhoda is a blend across Rioja, which would be Rioja's tradition as well.
That would have been fun to do. That would have been fun to do, would have been the Cubilla, the Bilar, and the Rhoda as a flight.
We can do it. I thought story-wise, better to separate
Right, but I'm
because
just saying, compare the styles, would be
yeah,
fun.
yeah,
Be a
And
good
I
flight
think-
at the bar.
yeah, fun flight at the bar. But I think story-wise, they're easier separated in conception of what they're doing because they're three artistic different journeys.
Right, now they just start to come together because we've done,
Yeah.
it.
8 wines.
We've got the history. But no, now that you got the story going, but
Well, that's a great
it
wine
comes
to
together.
serve just to a lot of different people because it's really fun to do.
Yeah.
Everyone's gonna like it. It's my it has a little bit of everything that
Yeah.
people are gonna like.
Yeah, it does.
You got a straw, or are you just gonna chug?
So yeah, I think Rhoda is a really appealing wine to a lot of people. When I've presented it before and I've put it after or I've put it in there, it gets lost because it's not modern enough to make the point. And if I'm telling the story of modernism and I'm saying, well, this one's not quite what I want to say, whereas Pingus definitely says, yeah, well,
Modern.
yeah, says so. So with Rhoda, they make and we can find it on shelf. They make Cella, which is their less expensive bottle, but from Rioja. They make Crison, which is their Ribera property, and they make Rhoda Reserva, which is more rare. But those four we'll have. Labels are really close to one another.
But they'll be in the system, the POS, what you have to look at, the Reserva.
Yeah, you'll have to look and see. They once made it harder because one was called Rhoda and one was called Rhoda 1.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So it used to, so they gave it a little bit more distinction to it. So, okay. Last wine. Wanted to take it kind of, yeah, I love this wine. It's not doing what I want it to. Oh, I got an
Most
easy.
wine doesn't do what I want. Yeah.
You don't drink.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this is the queen of.
Is your Laurel smelling like a little grapey? I kind of wonder if the
It's floral, very floral.
Okay.
Yeah, I love floral.
well maybe we'll open another bottle and we can check it. Yeah.
So we were just discussing, like, to call it Tempranillo, is it the same as in French? Do you have to have a certain percentage in order to call it, like, you have it down percent, this is a blend.
Do you know?
You have to have it here.
I well I don't
No, I.
yeah I don't
I don't know what it is.
Sorry, a lot of my knowledge at this point comes from what I'm hearing from producers.
Sure.
So if producers don't mention it, I'm like,
It's not
right,
right.
it doesn't ever.
It's just probably the major percentage of the wine is Tempranillo.
Well, and I kind of wonder if in these regions where they have traditionally been a blend, it's sort of not as important
Yeah.
as it might be in the U.S. Because it's a blend. It's always been a blend.
It's just that
Like-
sometimes people come in and they say, I want a Tempranillo. Okay, so this
Oh.
is a blend. You say, and then, so you could explain to him,
If people come in and say, I want a Tempranillo, I would just relate all of these as Tempranillos and not
Okay.
introduce, because the Spaniards would think of, if there was a Spaniard selling wine in our store, you want a Tempranillo? Oh, these are of course Tempranillo.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not trying to put on an accent there, although I accidentally did. Like, they would say, of course, this is Tempranillo. They wouldn't, like, no, it's a blend, and that confuses people.
Okay, yeah, it
Of
does.
course, if it's Grenache, don't sell them Grenache as Tempranillo, but
Rioja
Yeah.
says that it has to be 95% of the authorized grapes, but that can be
That could be
Right,
any blend
yeah,
of those
yeah.
other.
and certainly places like
Because it's
85%.
places like Ribera have the hard thing of like, well, there's always been Cab and Merlot, so you can't get around it. So, okay, let's sort of take that and go to Priorat before I lose you guys or myself to drinking Laurel. Okay, so we're gonna go up here and we're gonna go to just south of Barcelona. And we're gonna go to an area called Priorat. Now, a couple of things to know. There's the area so Priorat is a mountain, and maybe confusingly enough, the major mountain in Priorat is called Montsant. So the mountain of Montsant sits in the DO of Priorat, and then surrounding the denominated zone Priorat is Monsanto. So so you get Monsanto Mountain in Priorat, and then surrounding Priorat is the Monsanto Dio. Okay, we're going to talk about Priorat, and then we can relate back to Monsanto. So Priorat has a long history of making wines, and that history is actually because of the Hermetic tradition. And by Hermetic here, I mean hermits, right? So I know this is going way back, so just drink large glasses of Laurel until I circle the point so much that you're confused, and we'll open another bottle of Laurel because I think something's up with that one. But the Hermetic tradition, starting with early Christianity, that was one of the ways to enjoy or to explore Christianity, was to give up everything and go and meditate on your Christian faith. Certainly that was actually popular in Egypt and Palestine. It was popular in Ireland and the Falklands and the Northern Isles, of going and getting away from everything and being a hermit. Hence hermits. Now, one of the interesting things about being a hermit is if you got famous for your godliness or your religiosity, people would want to follow you and follow your tradition, but you were trying to be a hermit. Right? So it's the contradiction of, if you're a really good hermit, suddenly people want to follow you and understand how you've achieved what you've achieved. Well, in Priorat, there was actually a very strong Hermetic tradition. What you would do is, that's for me? Yeah. Oh, now I have 3 glasses of Laurel. This is great tasting.
Laurel flight.
If you're going to pour yourself another glass of Laurel, don't pour it in the glass where the chocolate was. I think the chocolate is making Laurel something that it quite shouldn't be. But we did open another bottle, so just pour Laurel into one of the other red wine glasses. So in Priorat, there was a strong Hermetic tradition. And if you go there, you can sense why. It's very difficult to get to. It's very mountainous. And as you go up, the terrain gets rougher and rougher. And in particular, as you go up into the mountain of Monsanto, it's extremely rough terrain. So if you really wanted to get away from it all, this would be a great place to go. Now, it got so famous in this tradition that they had to found a priory. They had to found a monastery because so many people and so many hermits were visiting. That is actually why Priorat is called Priorat. It's the priory. So that those two words are the same. And it's the priory of Scala Dei. And Scala Dei is the stairway to God. And again, if you're there and you keep climbing and then you start climbing Monsanto, and it's actually famous for a particular herb as well that you can smoke and do wonderful things with, you can understand why you might have visions of climbing the stairway to God. Okay?
Stairway to heaven.
Yes, stairway to heaven.
And riding a bear naked.
And riding the bear naked.
All
Well,
together.
that was down.
First
That's
line
a
to the last line.
different tradition. Different glass of
A
wine.
little pink.
That's mushrooms. Yeah, mushrooms.
So Scala Dei is actually an operating monastery, and you can go visit it. And it was founded because of this Hermetic tradition of going up into the mountains, or excuse me, up into the mountain and getting away from it in order to feel and study Christianity. Of course, if you're going to found a monastery, you have to have grapes, and so you have to have wine. And so that's the start, or the rebirth, the ancient rebirth of wine in the Priorat. Now, the Priorat, much like Ribera Sacra, is very steep. It's a different climate. Ribera Sacra is cool, over here is very cool, and it's based on shale. In the Priorat, you're actually very warm, and it's based on a soil type that's slate, which they call micarilla. And it looks sort of like charcoal. I mean, really, in intense spots where it's exposed, it looks like charcoal. So you're essentially planting vines in charcoal at really steep climbs. So this is a very difficult place to grow, and you're not going to grow much. Now, here I've heard 2 different things about the Priorat, and we can see which one we think about and which one we synthesize. One thing I've heard is that the tradition of winemaking has always been there since the founding of the priory, and has continued on until present day. And indeed, I visited some co-ops which had been around for a long time, and co-ops are significant there because with these steep hillsides and terraces and the licoria, you're going and you've got little parcels here and there, and you band together as a particular village, and make wine in one location because that's all you had for it. That's what you had. Now, I have heard that that tradition was relatively fading. Even with the Franco years, that tradition was fading down. And the reason is because vineyard yields were extremely low. I think the average vineyard yield in the Priorat this day and age is around 0.5 tons per hectare, or per acre, I should say. And to give some sort of frame of reference, and I think I've said this to you guys before, in Willamette Valley, and I've talking to producers, 2.2 tons is kind of a favored place to be. You're not overcropping, but you're not undercropping either. You're in a nice place to go and harvest at 2.2 tons. I've heard from Kenny in Santa Cruz Mountains that when he drops below 1 ton an acre, the vineyard, he really shouldn't bother with it. It commercially cannot be a success. It's too low to make any sort of profit off of it. So 1 ton an acre, you might as well just give it up and stop doing it. He continues to farm some of his vineyards, but you might as well stop. Central Valley, California, it's easy to go to 8 tons an acre. Riverland in Australia, where there's very little disease pressure, you can take Sauv Blanc up to 22 tons an acre. So vast differences. But at 0.5 tons an acre, you'd be at a real breaking point, especially because the wines weren't worth a lot of money. So really, one story I've heard is there's not much reason to farm grapes, not much reason to be there either. There's a reason it was for hermits. They should make it and keep it for hermits. And by the 1980s, it was really dying out. Now, the thing that happens is, and this is another story, and I've heard it, and I believe it as well, is that there are 8 people who come back to the region. I don't want to say led by René Barbier, but René Barbier was from the region. He makes a wine called Clos Morgador, La Ermita, and I'll remember his name. The gal who makes this wine, Daphne Glorian. There were 8 people who came back, and they were very young at the time. They were international. One of them was from the region. I think 4 of them were Spanish. She's American. And they said, wow, this region, these terraces, this heat, these amazing grapes, why don't we make wine here? So the 8 of them decided to make wine, and they made wine in one facility together, but as 8 different wineries, all named in some way French. So they named, for whatever cutesy reason, they all named their wineries as if they were French wineries. So Daphne Glorian named hers Clos Erasmus. René Barbier named his La Ermita. Clos Morgador, I think, is the closest to the region. So these 8 producers go and they make wine. That's actually the rebirth of modern Priorat. Somewhat like what you saw with Peter Sissek in Pingus and Riviera del Duero, these wines become an international sensation, and they're in very small quantities. You know, I think Daphne Glorian makes 600 6-packs of Clos Erasmus. So they're all made in tiny, tiny quantities, yet they're discovered, and discovered both by Parker and internationally, because La Ermita has a huge European following, and the region essentially blows up. So these 8 people are still there making wine, but the region has become very significant in terms of its production. It also, oddly enough, sees a flood of European rich people, including pop stars, building wineries in the region. Why here? Who knows? But it's there. And in fact, we dined in an abandoned mansion on one of the valley floors. It was designed to be not like Degas, like the man who built the famous church that hasn't been finished. Gaudi. Yeah, so this pop star created a mansion in the style of Gaudi that was a winery and a resort facility, and then abandoned it in Priorat, and we ate in the abandoned basement.
Cool.
Wow.
Awesome, but very, yeah. So,
Gaudy, Gaudy.
yeah, Gaudi. So in any case, this new style of making wine. So these 8 producers and make this new style of wine in the Priorat. And what is the new style? It's the acceptance that there are going to be very low yields, and those very low yields are going to yield ultra concentrated grapes. And then it's also the idea that they're going to use modern winemaking equipment to preserve the fruit character of those grapes. And then they're going to oak the wines. And they would now say oak the wines to the level that the fruit needs it for support. I think back in the day, it was just oaking the shit out of the wines. So they would really oak the wines. But back in the day, and this would be mid-90s, that was incredibly popular. I remember those wines, and they would sell like hotcakes. So big, powerful extracted wines with a lot of oak on them. Now, the thing to tie this together and kind of wrap us back to the first wine we had is that the main grape variety of this region is Grenache. Yeah. Now, Grenache, I told you, it's fun to explore Grenache across this whole arc of the Mediterranean because it's going to show you so many different things. Here, Grenache is showing you a very dark fruit, a fruit character, a black fruit character to it, and I think is incredibly interesting this way. But it's also in the Priorat where Grenache picks up a really interesting blending partner, which is Carignan. So throughout the rest of the Mediterranean crescent and probably the rest of the world, Carignan is thought as a cheap bulk variety. But it's in Priorat where Carignan is really prized, and sometimes prized as a solo variety. Although the thought is that it takes Carignan about 100 years in the ground, so when it turns its century, that's when it becomes super interesting. Luckily for these producers, they had a lot of 100-year-old Carignan material hanging around. So that's why you get Grenache blended with Carignan as opposed to in Côte d'Aron, Syrah, and Mourvèdre. Now the final note about this, you'll see there's a touch of Syrah and a touch of Cabernet to it. With the 1990s, Syrah and Cab, not like Vega Sicilia where it was founded with them, but with the 1990s, Syrah and Cab started being planted in the Priorat as well. So in talking to producers, they also call those indigenous varieties at this point. They're varieties that are part of the region because the region really restarts in 1995 or in the mid-90s with these 8 vintners. So it's part of the region to have those grape varieties blended in at this point.
Isn't that the
So-
one area in Europe that didn't, wasn't affected by phylloxera? No? It was so high up?
I don't know. I didn't hear that from them. So I guess most of it, there's a lot of old vines there. So, yeah.
It's a pretty,
So-
it's a pretty.
But powerful wines. I think again the style has moderated a touch here. Not so much, still oak, but not so much. And then showing the influence of that licoria, the black slate character to it, and I think that gives it its black fruit character in the wine. Sorry, I should make maybe the obvious connection that I didn't. So Daphne Glorian is the winemaker. The winery is called Clos Erasmus. It's now called Erasmus and Terrace because all of the vineyards are terrace, but it was founded as Clos Erasmus. So this wine is Clos Erasmus Laurel. Laurel bay leaves are common, bay trees are common in the area. Clos Erasmus Laurel is her introductory wine. The estate only makes 2. It makes Clos Erasmus and this one. So
I love, I'm a pre-rat nut.
Yeah.
This drink's so light to me
yeah,
for most
yeah,
pre-rats.
Yeah.
It just like,
Yeah, but
I
it's so
expect a
pure
big kick
fruity,
in the
though.
face and it doesn't.
More
do
red
that.
fruit than blue fruit.
Yeah.
yeah. So okay,
It's a skip.
you can rotate.
Skeptics.
Yeah, you can rotate your page, and voila, my favorite page of every tasting, the order form. You can order if you want. We can separate it out by store and get it to where it needs to be. You don't have to go. You can go back and taste through. And if you have any more questions, let me know. And please try and remember those 3